All right, continuing our look at the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testament. We have seen the interplay between the descendants of Seleucid and Ptolemy. Seleucid in the north, Ptolemy in the south. Seleucid over the area which is called Syria and other areas as well, but Syria is the home base, and Ptolemy over Egypt. We have seen how they have attacked one another, they've married into one another's families, all those things that are a part of the trying to have peace and also having conflict. We were, we covered verse, let's think of verse 8, but that was day before, wasn't it? What verse are we on today? You covered 14 and 15. Yeah. Okay. I think maybe the last thing maybe was the conditions that Rome put on Antiochus III after defeating him. Right. We had 4 conditions. They were part of the treaty. Antiochus had to surrender much of his property, and there was a border established. Secondly, he had to surrender his elephant brigade, his navy, and 20 hostages. Thirdly, he had to surrender Hannibal. Fourthly, he had to pay a lot of money. And I think we saw yesterday that he returned to his own country, according to verse 19 of Daniel 11. And in order to get the money to pay Rome, he went to a local temple and was going to steal gold from there, but the local populace did not take kindly to that and overwhelmed him and his small guard and killed him. And then that takes us to verse 20 of Daniel 11. Then in his place, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. All right, so we have Antiochus III is killed, and we're told that there is one who will arise following Antiochus III. And let's go back to the, oops. So here's Antiochus III. Remember, he married his daughter off to Ptolemy V, but he has two sons, Antiochus IV and Seleucus IV. What happens is this: his older son, Seleucus IV, was the one who was the next in line. In fact, where is Antiochus IV at this time? Do you remember? He was one of the hostages taken to Rome. All right, keep that in mind. Seleucus IV then succeeds Antiochus III as the king over the area that the Seleucids still controlled. And he heavily taxed the people in order to pay Rome, because even though his dad's dead, they still owe the money to Rome. His dad tried to get it from a temple, was unsuccessful. Seleucus still has to pay the money. So he's not going to go rob a temple at this point, but he decides he's going to, the way to raise the money is to tax the people, and so he does that. So, who is the one that he would send out? Who is the oppressor? We see that in verse 20. The one who arises will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Well, maybe they'll ought to back off of that a little bit and say, what is the jewel of his kingdom? What's the most important part of the kingdom that the Seleucids controlled? What area had Antiochus III taken over in the conflict with Egypt? And I told you that they would hold on to that. They would never lose it. to Ptolemy again. What area would God say is the jewel? Israel. So, Seleucus IV sends an oppressor out into the area of Israel. And what is an oppressor? Stephen? In this case, it would be a tax collector. So he's sending a tax collector out into Israel, every place, but remember Daniel, God through Daniel is concerned about what's happening in Israel. And Seleucus had a special fundraiser whose name was Heliodorus. Now, according to what we find in 2 Maccabees, which is a book in between the Old and New Testament, a Jewish book, included in some Bibles, a certain traitorous Jew named Simon sent information to the king that the Jerusalem temple contained sufficient treasure to meet all the king's needs. You don't have to tax everybody. The temple in Jerusalem has enough gold that you could use to pay off Rome. Well, his treasury was about depleted, partly through the yearly payments he had to make to Rome. And so he eagerly grasped at the idea of plundering the temple in Jerusalem. And so he sent off Heliodorus to carry out this assignment. So Heliodorus is on his way to Jerusalem to plunder it in order to use that gold, that silver, to pay off Rome. On his way there, he had a frightful vision of mighty angels assaulting him and flogging him. He kind of got the impression that maybe it was a bad idea to go to Jerusalem and take stuff out of the temple. And so he decided against it. And he returned home empty-handed. Now, before we go on with the rest of the story, at the same time, there is written a book that's also included in some Bibles in between the Old and New Testament that is called the Apocrypha, a book called Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiasticus was written about this time. All right, so Heliodorus comes back to Seleucus III. And how do you think Seleucus responded to the fact that he has come back empty-handed? Yeah, I'm not there yet. What do you think Seleucus III, how do you think he responded? Do you think he said, oh, I understand. You did your best. He'd be pretty upset, wouldn't he? Because he was kind of expecting all of this treasure to come from the temple. Notice what it says in Daniel, the last part of verse 20. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle. Now, what does that sound like? What's that sound like is going to happen to Seleucus III? He's going to die, but it's not going to be in battle, and it's not going to be in anger. So, maybe assassination? Let's see what happens. Seleucus III reigned for about 12 years. Wasn't very good at it. But he did not die in battle, and he did not die in a mob action like his father had. Yet he seemed to have met an untimely end, and the speculation by some is that he was poisoned by Heliodorus. So we can only imagine what took place when Heliodorus came back empty-handed from Jerusalem. And that maybe Seleucus threatened him in some way. Somehow, Heliodorus got the impression that he needed to get rid of Seleucus III. And so he poisoned him. This then brings Antiochus IV to the throne. Seleucus is dead. That means Antiochus IV is the next in line. and he is in Rome, so it's easy for Rome to say, okay, you're next. You can rule over that area. All right, now we look in verse 21, and we see this happening. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. All right, so this despicable person is Antiochus IV, and we'll see why as we go along. Now, Rome did not say, you're the next king, but he left. He'd been trained in Rome, and he left, and came at a time of peace. No one was apparently ruling in light of the assassination of Seleucus III, and so Antiochus IV just kind of walks in and says, I'm taking over. On the right hand, you see the explanation. In the second part of Daniel's dream of the ram and the goat, remember that, the two-horned ram and the single-horned goat, we saw that there's a small horn that comes out of one of the four horns of the ram, and gains power to the southeast and the promised land. This is fulfilled by Antiochus IV. He's the small horn. The throne rightly belonged to Demetrius Soter. So it should have passed from Seleucus IV to his son Demetrius. But instead, Antiochus came in and took the throne. Demetrius also was a hostage in Rome, and that's why he wasn't there to take it over. Antiochus kind of beat him back to claim the throne. And so Uncle Antiochus becomes the ruler in charge of the government as a prince regent. He is allowed to rule that way. Antiochus IV seized the throne, as we see at the end of verse 21, seized the kingdom by intrigue. He didn't come by it rightfully. He kind of snuck his way, maneuvered his way in. Ancient historians describe Antiochus IV as volatile and unstable. He sought to create a united Seleucid empire from a variety of diverse elements. So there are a lot of different people living within the area that he controlled. He tried to bring them together to have a solid empire. The people were different politically, culturally, and religiously. And those who refused to be fully assimilated into this coalition government, if you will, of different peoples, were considered a threat. And they were forced into a policy of Hellenization. Because Antiochus IV is trying to make everybody kind of the same. And the same that would work is Hellenization. Make everybody like the Greeks. And of course, those who did refuse to be assimilated, who refused to become Greek in their thinking, were the Jews. So they stand out to him as those that are most resistant to what he wants to accomplish in his kingdom. Early in his reign, Antiochus IV had been approached by a younger member of the high priestly family named Jason. Now, Jason is not a Hebrew name. That's a Greek name. So you can already tell that this guy had accepted Greek culture. His Hebrew name was Joshua. And he promised the king that if he would depose from office the current legitimate high priest, whose name was Onias III, that he, Jason, would pay the king a handsome bribe for the service. So you get the picture? Jason's going to give the king a bribe if he makes him high priest, gets rid of the high priest that is there, who is the legitimate high priest. And then Jason, now, he's going to be high priest. You know what that means in Israel. He's the representative of God to the people, right? He's the mediator between the people and God. The only one who once a year can go into the Holy of Holies on the day of Yom Kippur. All right? Now, what else does he promise in Antiochus IV? That if he makes him high priest, not only would he pay a bribe, but he also promised to build a temple to the Greek god Phallus and also a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Can you imagine? The high priest, which he would be, is going to build a temple to a Greek god right there in Jerusalem, and also a gymnasium. No, what's wrong with that? Don't Jewish people like to work out? What would be offensive about having a gymnasium in Jerusalem?
It's not part of the customs.
Yeah, it's not part of the customs, but there's a particular aspect of a gymnasium that would be particularly offensive to the Jews. Do you remember the Olympics? John?
It was just for the gods.
No. No, men participated in the Olympics. But how did they participate? In what manner did they participate? Which would be the same manner they exercised in the gymnasium.
No clothes.
Right, naked. Jewish men would not be going anywhere naked, not be naked anywhere. They were very modest about that kind of thing, and so that would be an affront to the Jewish people as well to have a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Well, Antiochus was happy to accede to this request. Onias was removed, and Jason installed in his place. Now look over at verse 22, and you see what Daniel predicts. The overwhelming forces will be fluttered away from before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. The prince of the covenant would be the high priest. Now, once the precedent of imperial interference had been set, that is, where the king can interfere with who the high priest is, well, another Jew comes along by the name of Menelaus and offered Antiochus a bribe still larger than Jason's. So once you start doing that, you just open to whoever gives the biggest bribe. And Antiochus didn't have any scruples about supplanting one rascal with another, as long as he himself was enriched in the process. Besides, Jason wasn't moving fast enough in getting the Jewish people to Hellenize. So in 172 BC, Menelaus took Jason's place and set about selling some of the votive offerings and golden utensils of the temple to raise the cash necessary for the bribe. You see, what he is doing is he's promised to pay a bribe, but he's going to get the money from the temple. It's not his money. At this sacrilege, the godly high priest Onias, even though he had been deposed, earnestly protested, and so angered Menelaus that he had Onias killed. But this murder so angered the populace of Jerusalem that they became bitter against Menelaus and sent representatives to Antiochus himself to accuse Menelaus and his wicked brother Lysimachus. Well, Antiochus did respond. He did execute Andronicus, who was the agent of Menelaus, who had murdered Onias. But a little later, a courtier Menelaus had bribed persuaded Antiochus to act against the Jerusalemites, so those who had complained about Menelaus. Instead of punishing Menelaus as he deserved, Antiochus had the Jerusalem representatives put to death in Tyre, where the whole matter was being adjudicated. Now look over verse 23. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them. And he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. Look what happened. He practiced deceit and pretended to be a second-century Robin Hood. He was stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, so he said, but in reality what he was doing was giving it to his friends. His prestige and power rose with the help of a comparatively small group of people in fulfillment of what it says in 23. And he brought peace to his realm by redistributing the wealth, mostly to his followers. Now, Antiochus had no wish to just Hellenize his conquered subjects. He wanted to denationalize them entirely. He wanted no one in his realm to think of themselves as being of a certain nationality. He wanted them all to think of themselves as being part of his kingdom. So in 171, September the 6th of that year, Antiochus began his evil actions toward the temple because he was extremely anti-Semitic, because the Jews would not give in. They would not become Hellenized. So verse 25, look over on the left. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south, which is where? King of the south is where? It's where? What's in the south? Egypt. Seriously, we don't know that by now? After all the times we've gone over, we've been doing this for what? 3 or 4 days now? The south is Egypt. So he's going to go against them with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. All right, what happened? In 181, Ptolemy the sixth, who is right here, had ascended the Egyptian throne at the age of 6. His mother was Cleopatra. Remember Cleopatra, who was the daughter of Antiochus the Great? Remember how she had married over into the other line? Well, that's the mother of Ptolemy the Sixth, who is the next ruler of Egypt. She actually governed for him until she died. But after he assumed power as king, he determined to recapture the regions of Palestine and Phoenicia that had been lost to Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. And at first his invasion met with considerable success, for he had challenged Antiochus IV, who we've just been talking about, who's trying to Hellenize the Jews. He had challenged him with a large and well-equipped army. Antiochus was able to move his army from his homeland up in Syria to the very border of Egypt before the Egyptian army near the Nile Delta met him. But eventually, Ptolemy the Sixth encountered difficulty being betrayed. Now, notice in verse 26 that there will be schemes devised against him, and those who eat his choice food will destroy him. What happened is that Ptolemy the Sixth was betrayed by some of the friends who ate at the same table as him. The Egyptians were defeated, and at this point Antiochus proposed friendship with Egypt. Ptolemy the Sixth was captured, having been betrayed by his friends, and became a prisoner of Antiochus IV, who now calls himself Epiphanes, which means manifest of God. It's a divine title. What it shows us here is that the Jewish people changed the name a little bit. They changed it from calling him the manifestation of God to Epiphanes, which means the maniac, the madman. Well, the young king, Ptolemy the Sixth, was, remember, the nephew of Antiochus IV, because it's his sister that was the mother of Ptolemy the Sixth. So Uncle Antiochus pretended like he was friends with Ptolemy the Sixth, and took his young nephew to Syria. Pretended to be nice to him, befriend him, but neither the uncle nor the nephew trusted each other. Both of them pretended to be friends, but peace was never realized because they both were being deceptive. Look at verse 27. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. Why? Well, because they're eating at the same table. But it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Well, at this point, the Egyptians have given up hope that their king, Ptolemy the Sixth, is going to come back. He's been captured by his uncle, Antiochus IV, and they say, okay, he's done. And so they decided to appoint the younger brother of Ptolemy the Sixth, whose name was Physcon, as king in his place. Well, when Antiochus IV learned about this, he used some deception and intervened on behalf of Ptolemy VI, who was his prisoner, and he mounted an expeditionary force against Physcon's government in order to reestablish Ptolemy VI on the throne. So he's saying to his nephew, look, your brother has taken over your throne. I'm going to go down there and help you get it back. Sounds reasonable. So now he's acting as the ally of Ptolemy VI instead of his adversary. So as the price of his help in expelling Physcon, Antiochus made a treaty of friendship and alliance with Philometor, that's Ptolemy VI, also called Philometor, aimed at obtaining a foothold in Egypt itself. In other words, his ulterior motive was, I'm going to help Ptolemy VI Philometor get back on the throne, but it's only going to be so that I can then get a way into Egypt and eventually take it over. The seriousness of this aim is attested by the issue of coinage that bore the same types as the corresponding Ptolemaic coinage, with the head of Zeus on one side and the Ptolemaic eagle on the other. But on the coins, Antiochus had printed King Antiochus, God manifest, Antiochus Epiphanes, rather than the usual Egyptian of Ptolemy the king. All right, though these Egyptian-type coins were presumably used in the Seleucid territory rather than Egypt itself, at least shows us what Antiochus' intentions were. His intentions were to take over Egypt, and he had coins prepared for that eventuality. Look at verse 28. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. What's the Holy Covenant? From God's perspective, from Daniel's perspective, what is the Holy Covenant? What would a covenant be? What's another word for covenant?
Promise.
Promise, agreement. Sometimes we call it a testament. So what was the holy agreement? Can you think of any agreement between God and his people that might be called the Holy Covenant? What would it be? Did God have any agreements between himself and his people? Did he have a covenant with Israel? Matthew, can you not think of a covenant that God had with Israel? Stephen, you can't think of a covenant that God had with Israel? None of you can think of a covenant. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Moses? Have you heard of Moses? Are you familiar with Moses? Does that sound familiar? Have you heard that name? Have you? Did Moses have anything to do with a covenant with Israel? Well, that wasn't the covenant. What was the covenant? What was the agreement that Moses brought Israel that showed that they were God's people and God gave them things that they were to do?
Commandments.
Commandments? Like, how many were there? 10. Oh, 10 commandments. Oh, have we heard about the 10 commandments? You know about that, do you? And what was that part of? A covenant. What covenant? Named after the person who brought it to the people. The Mosaic covenant. Have you never heard? You've never heard of the Mosaic covenant? Commonly called the Old Testament. The Mosaic covenant, which gave the people the sacrificial system that they were to perform as part of the covenant with God. that God would protect them, they would be his people, and they were to respond by offering sacrifices, all of that whole thing. Is this totally outside the realm of your knowledge? You act like you've never heard these things before. That's the Holy Covenant. So if he's acting against the Holy Covenant, he's set against the Holy Covenant, what is he? What's his attitude? He's against the Jewish law. He's against the Old Testament law. He's against the Mosaic law. He's against the whole sacrificial system. He's against the temple in Jerusalem. He's against everything that makes the Jewish people in relationship with God. He's against it all. Why? Was he against every other people that had sacrifices to their gods? No. Why is he against the Jewish people?
Because they wouldn't be similar to Greek culture.
Exactly. Because they wouldn't become Hellenized. Their religious beliefs were keeping them from that. So he is set against that. And he will take action against them. And then he's going to return to his own land. So he returns from Egypt with a lot of plunder. And then it says he is set against the Holy Covenant. He's going to take action. And then he's going to return to his own land. All right, what happened? Antiochus carried a lot of wealth with him back from Egypt. He didn't totally take over Egypt, but he had enough influence that he took a lot of wealth back with him. But because he had not been able to totally conquer Egypt, he was rather frustrated. And so when he comes through Jewish territory, when he comes through the area of Jerusalem, the fact that he had not conquered Egypt, he takes out on the Jews. And he desecrates and loots the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, he was against the whole Mosaic system, the Holy Covenant. But after desecrating the temple, he then goes back to his own country. Later on, however, Antiochus' alliance with Philometor, Ptolemy VI Philometor, were so thin that his reestablished protege, Ptolemy VI, decided to make peace with his brother, Physcon, the brother who had been defeated, who had tried to take over, because he felt he needed his help in getting rid of Antiochus' troops from the border fortress between Egypt and the other, and next door. All right, so he's able to raise a considerable army for the expulsion of the Seleucid army. So what's happening? Ptolemy and his brother are now getting together to drive out Uncle Antiochus, Antiochus IV. And we see that in verse 29. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. So Antiochus is going to come to Egypt once again. Only this time, he's not going to be successful like he was, at least partially successful before. And we're going to see the reason why in verse 30, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Now, we don't know what that is yet, but we'll find out. So what happens? Because these brothers get together to fight against Uncle Antiochus, Antiochus learns of this, and so he marches again down to Egypt, intending to take over once and for all. Now, when he gets near Alexandria, his efforts to take over Egypt were forestalled by the intervention of the Roman fleet. The Roman ships had come, which had been hurriedly dispatched to Alexandria from Crete. Crete is a more modern term for Kittim. So when Daniel prophesied the ships of Kittim will come, he's talking about ships coming from Crete, and they were Roman ships. They came in response to the urgent request of the Ptolemies. They sent out a distress signal. Rome, come help us against Antiochus IV. Now, the Roman commander, Popilius Lanus, met Antiochus, who was getting his army ready for a siege of Alexandria. But this Roman officer landed and came up to Antiochus and informed him that the Roman government was ordering him to leave Egypt immediately, or face the consequences of war with Rome. Would Antiochus understand war with Rome? Yeah, he lived in Rome for a good part of his life. He knew what that meant. But even so, he apparently, and plus his father had been beaten by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia, remember? So it didn't take him very long to give in to his mandate, especially after Popilius drew a circle around him with his staff and ordered him to make his decision before he stepped out of the circle. Antiochus, I'll give you all the time you need to make the decision that you want, but you just got to make it before you step outside this circle. Kind of hurried him along a little bit, don't you think? And so Antiochus had to give in. This was a humiliating defeat for Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's what it means when it says over in Daniel, he will lose heart. But he had no alternative because Rome would have wiped him out. And so he had to return to his own land. Well, if he was upset the last time he came through Jerusalem, this time he is even more upset. And we're going to see that he's going to take even more strong action against the Jewish people, which is going to end up in a war in Israel. And we'll find out about that tomorrow.